Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
Glad to have with us Hornell history teacher Mark Smith, and today we're talking about the 21st Georgia Infantry doing their reenactment of the Civil War and the Battle of Lane's Mill. Mark Smith, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Brian. It's always good to be here.
So you've got the Battle of Lane's Mill coming up this weekend. That's in Kenesteel. We can always hear that up here on Ashball Hill. You hear the booming, roaring cannon and rifle sounds up here on Ashball Hill from the Battle of Lane's Mill. I have a few questions for you. Do I want to do history first, or do I want to get right to the reenactment? Okay, first off, tell us the reenactment dates, location, and hours.
We're up at Lane Cider Mill, as we are every year. It's the first and second, Saturday and Sunday, this coming Saturday and Sunday. This year, actually, we'll be opening about 9 o'clock. It goes to about 5. There's a dance Saturday night. This year, however, we decided there's no charge for the public to come. All you have to do is come up and enjoy it. There's demonstrations throughout the day. There's a battle, at least one. There's medical demonstrations. There's demonstrations of how soldiers lived during that time. This year, we actually built breastworks. So we have sort of authentic Civil War era breastworks, which were used more towards the end of the war as the Confederates were losing bit by bit. So it's going to be kind of an exciting weekend for us.
Let me stop you right there and ask you about breastworks. What's that?
Early trenches. So what would happen is they would pile wood up, and then they'd dig dirt over the top of it, and that was enough to stop a bullet. And what it allowed soldiers to do is hide behind something, because early in the war they did that traditional line up in 2 rows, march across an open field, and shoot at each other. But as the Confederates were losing men percentage-wise, they couldn't maintain that kind of loss. So eventually they began building really permanent fortifications, kind of like what you found around Washington, D.C. at the time, and even Richmond. But it became more and more so. So it's kind of exciting for us.
Mark Smith, Civil War is the biggest reenactment that we have in this region. But there are a lot of battle and war reenactments. Could you list off just some of them?
For Civil War, every year, obviously, there's some other places in our state, and every major battle of the Civil War eventually has a reenactment. Gettysburg happens every year in July. There's also, just a couple of weeks ago, was the Battle of Newmarket, which was actually the battle where the cadets from the Virginia Military Institute marched out and fought. There's a not famous, but an excellent movie called The Field of Lost Shoes. Beyond Civil War reenacting, people are doing, and I've actually never seen them, though you can catch them on YouTube, World War I or World War II reenactments, especially World War II reenactments. Every year in Ohio, they reenact the D-Day invasion with landing craft and planes and things like that. I know several friends of mine have done that. That's pretty impressive, at least on video. I'm assuming when you're there, it's actually just as impressive. And they do reenactments. I've heard of reenactments of the Vietnam War. I've even heard of reenactments, actually, of the Gulf War more recently. So we're really kind of everywhere. It's been spreading. It's been growing. It's just a really kind of engaging time to understand history and the way soldiers fought, which is something you don't really see up close. It's easy to go to Washington, D.C. and go, oh, there's the White House. It's easy to go to New York City and see the harbor, or Boston and see those. But reenactments are that idea of really kind of experiencing or trying to understand in some small measure what it was like for the soldiers. And in no way can we truly do that, because we're not marching 20 miles onto a battlefield in 98-degree weather. We're marching 500 yards into a battlefield, 98-degree weather, and when it gets too hot, we're laying down and asking for someone to get us ice.
Now, it goes without saying that there was, in the 1860s, no Battle of Lane's Mills and Kenesteel, but you do draw from other battles, I believe. You look up and research what happened in this battle and that battle in the Civil War. Can you tell us what you're doing this year at the Battle of Lane's Mills in terms of what are you drawing from?
Well, actually, kind of excitingly, this is the 155th anniversary of Cold Harbor. Is actually happening that very weekend, the 1st and 2nd of July. And what Cold Harbor was, was the Grant's overland campaign. Lee had been steadily withdrawing attack by attack. There was a crossroads, which the Union had taken on one day, and the Confederates fought back, and then Union infantry showed up and pushed them back to Cold Harbor. The Cold Harbor had set fortifications, those breastworks I was talking about, a much larger scale. But Grant ordered an attack. He ordered actually 3 of them, and each one of them failed. And after the third one, his commanding officers below him refused to attack again. But we're using that as our basis. And the reason they refused to attack again is in Cold Harbor, one of the attacks, in 15 minutes, he loses 5,000 Union soldiers. And Grant is furious and rides to the front and then realizes what he'd done and said, okay, well, let's dig in here and we'll stay. But we're using that as our basis for our idea for the attacks on this weekend. So we're going to be doing some field battles, pushing Confederates back, Confederates taking the breastworks, holding off the Union. It's going to be kind of an exciting time.
Talking to Hornell High School history teacher Mark Smith, President Abraham Lincoln, who was assassinated in 1865 at the Ford Theater in Washington, D.C. Did President Andrew Johnson continue on as Lincoln would have wanted him to, or can Johnson be largely blamed for the fact that segregation took over where slavery left off, and we did not get the civil rights for African Americans for almost 100 years till after Lincoln died? Was the death of Lincoln that kind of devastating historical thing?
Yeah. Johnson was a compromise vice president. He was a Southerner. He stayed with the Union because he thought secession was foolish, and he was sort of a compromise to put him in there. And normally, even back then, and sometimes even today, a vice president's not picked because he's going to take over. He's picked because he brings in another region or he represents another region, and nobody really expects him to ever be in charge. Johnson didn't have the strength or the vision that Lincoln had. Johnson attempted to continue the ever-famous Lincoln 10% plan, where 10% of the South would apologize or take an oath of loyalty to the North, and then the state could reform a government and come back in. Johnson said, well, he's going to continue that, but Confederates have to seek a pardon. Ruling Confederates had to be pardoned by him, which everybody thought was a much stronger stance than Lincoln had, because most of the conservative Republicans didn't like the 10% plan. But then Johnson pardoned anybody who walked into the White House and said, excuse me, oh, yeah, you're pardoned. He had no problem with it. He pardoned anybody. He could have done it in his sleep. He did this in such a level, and then he began to fight with conservative Republicans at such a level. He didn't have the dynamic strength that Lincoln had. Lincoln, I don't want to say he controlled the conservative Republicans, but they respected him, and they didn't respect Johnson. So therefore, Johnson never could get anything he wanted to do off the ground. And so did it lead to segregation? Really, segregation isn't established until the 1870s the 1890s with Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. And that's long after Johnson. But was the groundwork put down? Originally, yeah. So much so that radical Republicans had to actually take over Reconstruction. They reinvaded the South. They set up military districts. They began arresting any member of the what is the early ages of the White League, what ultimately will become the Ku Klux Klan, though the Ku Klux Klan started more as a gentleman's club and eventually was perverted to something much worse, obviously much worse even to this day. But he was not strong enough to really hold the South and hold the North in place, and that's why he wasn't going to win re-election, and that's why he was impeached. Ultimately, he was set up to be impeached. The radical Republicans wanted him to be impeached, and they set it up, and he knew he was being challenged, and he challenged them right back. Amazingly, he did not get thrown out of office.
Talking to Hornell history teacher Mark Smith today on Newsmaker, and we're talking about Civil War history as we're coming closer this weekend to closer to the Battle of Lane's Mills in Canisteo, which is this weekend, Saturday and Sunday in Canisteo. So we talk about Lincoln, talk about Johnson, statues getting torn down. What do you make of that whole phenomenon?
I think we're spending a lot of time ignoring the potential that these statues could be. Do they represent men who did poor things and made poor judgments and did terrible things? In some cases, yes, they are. But as opposed to tearing them down, there was a historian, and I wish I could remember his name, who said we should reinterpret them, and the plaques below them should say, this is a man, he did these things. They are considered terrible even to this day. The statue here is so that we don't forget the terrible things that happened. I think the more that we hide our history, as a history teacher, it's that old phrase that if you ignore history, you're doomed to repeat it. If you hide history, you're going to repeat it as well, because we're not going to see it coming. There's patterns to history, and if we don't pay attention, so the statues should stay. What I've always, since this problem began, one of the things I've really kind of been impressed with is National Park Service said very early on, and has held to it, that no statues, no monuments are being removed from battlefields. But they also reinterpret those statues. Those statues are not celebrations of the men, they're celebrations of what happened on that battlefield. This happened here. The Virginia monument in Gettysburg stands roughly where Lee was standing when he was watching Pickett's charge. Those kind of things happen. So it's a slippery slope when you start hiding your history.
Talking to Hornell High School history teacher Mark Smith, who's taking part in and plays a very active role in the Civil War reenactment coming up this weekend. They're doing the Battle of Lanes Mills in Canisteo. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk this day in history, and then we'll continue our conversation about the upcoming Battle of Lanes Mills, which is this weekend, Saturday and Sunday, and it's free to the public for the first time. So it's an event that we definitely encourage you to get out and see. We'll be back in just a moment.
It's graduation time, and Steuben Trust has a smart, simple, and convenient checking account for students. The student account has no minimum account balance requirement, no opening deposit, and no monthly maintenance charge when enrolled in e-statements, and e-statements are free. Plus, you'll get a free Visa debit check card included with your account. Don't forget to take advantage of the mobile check deposit feature using the Steuben Trust mobile app, giving you 24/7 access to your account. Open your Steuben Trust student checking account online at steubentrust.com or at any one of our locations.
Guess who's back again? Meteorologist Rob. Tell a friend.
Brian O'Neill, good morning. Memorial Day weekend coming to its conclusion, and doing so with partly to mostly sunny skies, Brian. We've been fortunate so far. The weather's cooperated, though we did have to deal with some showers and thunderstorms yesterday. And we're going to have to deal with some more tomorrow. We've got an area of low pressure headed into the central United States that will bring us back into a cooler and wetter pattern, but at least we were able to squeeze the weekend in. Looks good through the remainder of the day. We'll call it mostly sunny. We're about 70 to 75. Clouds, though, they do start to arrive tonight. After midnight, there's a chance for showers and thunderstorms. We'll fall back to about 50 to 55. Low pressure will keep scattered showers and thunderstorms around tomorrow. A few may produce heavy downpours. Temperatures, they'll be somewhere between 67 and 72 tomorrow afternoon. Tomorrow night, there's a chance for showers and storms 60. We stay unsettled into Wednesday. Scattered showers and storms 75 to 80. Dries out very slowly for Thursday and Friday. Brian, sunrise this morning was at 5:38. It'll set tonight at 8:37.
Talking with Hornell High School history teacher Mark Smith. Mark Smith, when Gary Ostrower is on from Alfred University, and when Nick Waddy is on from Alfred State College, we do This Day in History. So as you're a history teacher at Hornell High, I thought we'd go over This Day in History for today. What do you got for us?
Today is the day that leader Mikhail Gorbachev came in for a 3-day talk with George Bush. They were discussing at the time, the problems within the Soviet Union as they were trying perestroika to improve the economy of the country, and how it was failing and it was eroding. They were also discussing the idea and concepts of a reunified Germany, which at that time, even that late, scared Russia to no end, because they were invaded, twice in 2 wars, over 25 million civilians and soldiers killed. So this is the anniversary of that, beginning of that conversation.
Now, before we went on the air, you brought up a funny story about the late Newsmaker show host Kevin Dorn announcing in 1984 about Yuri Andropov's demise.
Yeah, my mom and I were actually at the table, and I still remember it as the news began, and my mom couldn't stop laughing because Kevin Dorn began the whole thing with WLEA News. Well, another commie has bitten the dust, and that's how he began his broadcast about Andropov dying. But I think wasn't he the leader of Russia for like 45 minutes? It was not long.
Yeah, there was a period like that where they came and left quickly, raising some suspicions, I believe.
I think so too. Yeah, I remember that.
So what else do we have for this day in history, Mark?
U.S. unmanned space probe Mariner 9 was launched to gather scientific information on Mars, which has been going on since that date, 1971. Moving forward constantly, we're still on Mars. I have a teacher at school, a science teacher, who likes to point out that Mars is the only planet we know of that's entirely inhabited by robots.
On the topic of space travel, does the moon landing, the 1969 moon landing, come up as a topic in your class?
Well, it does, of course. The space race is definitely part of what I teach in 8th grade. We've even had the conversation constantly because I also teach 12th grade, and 12th graders love conspiracy theories. So the question is, did we actually land on the moon?
Do they ask that? Are they suspicious?
Oh, I have a whole group of students who've told me that we didn't land on the moon. It was faked. But I point out to them that if you look at the pictures, the way the sunlight hits the astronauts in the pictures, we would have to have had something like 10,000 lasers all blasting white light at a perfect horizontal way. In other words, we wouldn't have had the technology to fake the moon landing the way they claim the moon landing was faked.
So what they're claiming, I've heard this before from different people. What they'll say is that the moon landing was shot in a studio, filmed in a studio, and you can tell. And the reason you can tell is because you don't see them climbing out of the ladder with the camera in their hands, kind of thing. You see, the camera and a tripod is already out there for when they go out and walk out, and they say, "Well, that proves it." What do you say to that?
I actually thought that camera was mounted on an arm that was pointed at the lunar, and I may be wrong on that one. I'm not speaking that with any knowledge. But why go to that much effort to fake a moon landing? It was easier to prove to Russia that we could circle the Earth 500 times more than they could. That would have been an easier way to win the space race.
And wasn't that an O.J. Simpson movie, Capricorn 1 or Capricorn 9 or something like that? I seem to remember seeing that on TV. I won't tell the story about the time I met O.J. because I've told that too many times on the air. Talking to Hornell history teacher Mark Smith. Mark, let's get back to the Battle of Lanes Mill Civil War reenactment, which is coming up this weekend. For those who have never gone to it before, tell us, what is it like? What does it involve? How close do you stand to the reenactment? Are you using cap guns and the cannon effect? You can hear it echoing here on the hills. How does all that work?
Well, in attempts for realism, the rifles we use are authentic reproduction. They're reproductions, but they're authentic. You could actually use them as weapons. Of course, we don't have lead or actual ammunition rounds, so to speak. We use black powder. We just fire blanks. But because we're using the same amount of black powder that they used during the Civil War, you get pretty much the same sound. So when you come up, and actually, I'm sorry, to go on with cannon. Cannon, same thing. They're not firing actual live shells, but they're firing enough black powder. About, I think it's, I'd have to check, but I think it's close to a pound of black powder is fired through those, which gives you that roar of a cannon. So when you come up, there's a giant field. It looks like you're almost, you follow the signs, it looks like you're almost nowhere, and then you park, you walk in. There'll be tents, there'll be demonstrations. When the battles are about to come, there'll be an announcement for that. We try to get the public as close as safely can be. As always pointed out to me, when you fire one of the muskets, one of the Enfields, the flame shoots out about 3.5 feet. So we try to keep the public away from that enough. But they're going to see a lot of it. They're going to hear a lot of it. They're going to, with the wind right, they're going to be caught up in the smoke of the battle. It's going to be kind of a fun time. They're always very exciting to see and to be a part of and even view. I used to watch reenactments. It's one of the reasons I got interested in becoming a reenactor.
And Mark Smith, you'll be able to, the audience and the people who are going for the first time who may not be Civil War experts, you'll be able to tell the Union Army because they'll be in blue. You'll be able to tell the Confederate Army because they'll be wearing gray uniforms. And about how many people do you have taking part in it on the Union side and on the Confederate side? And tell us about that.
I'm not actually sure of the numbers this year because we have a few units joining us who have not been before. But at a rough guess, I think we're looking at a little bit over 100 Confederates. And actually, I think this year almost maybe about 100 or a little over 100 Union, which is the largest group we've had since our first year. We're kind of excited to invite a couple of units down from, I think, Ohio are joining us this year. We're kind of excited about that. So, and as far as blue and gray, the Union will be in blue. Confederates are in gray. They're in a brown that's called butternut. Some of them are in blue. Confederate military uniforms, while they were standardized on paper, normally by mid-war, sort of began going with whatever you could get, unless the state had money, in which case they did provide uniforms. But that didn't happen in a lot of the states, especially Virginia slowly became poorer and poorer because most of the war was fought there. North Carolina, South Carolina. Georgia actually remained a lot of its wealth until Sherman's march in, and then they lost quite a bit of it there.
A final question for you. Actually, I have a PS to that afterwards. A couple final questions here. Clara Barton, as I'm sure you know, is from Dansville. She was the person who founded the Red Cross as a result of going into, I believe, Civil War battles. She had a sibling, I think, who was in the Civil War. Does anyone ever play the part of Clara Barton? And do you have any women who take part in this as, say, a nurse at the time, playing the role of the nurses at the time?
We've had women take the role of nurses in the past. We have no one playing Clara Barton, though. A few years back, we were in Dansville during their Clara Barton Day, and we, as Confederates, talked about stealing her and kidnapping her away because she was helping the wounded on the battlefield. But we've had women play the role of nurses in the past. Most of the women we have today who reenact with us, at least at Lanesville, not all of them, but take the place of what would be considered camp helpers. Women were allowed to sit outside the camp and cook. They were allowed to do laundry. They had to have permission. Weirdly enough, the most fascinating thing I ever learned about the Civil War was how laundry was done during the Civil War, because it was absolutely fascinating. And I stood for an hour while a woman explained how laundry was done during the Civil War, which you wouldn't expect to be exciting, but it was just fascinating because it started with they had to have a letter from the minister in their hometown stating that they are women of good character, and then they had to have permission from the commanding general to even set up a camp laundry. So that's a lot of what they do. We also do I think schoolroom. I'm not sure if it's going to happen during our school days. Definitely school demonstrations, how schools were set up at the time. So and we have actually women who joined the ranks during the Civil War. There's an estimated, and I'm going to get the number wrong, and someone's going to yell at me, about 1,500 women joined the ranks in the Union, and almost a similar number in the South, because they wanted to fight. And there's pictures now. If you go online and look for women in the Civil War, you'll find the pictures of women dressed as soldiers, and it's the soldier, that old black and white picture soldiers that they have. But if you look very closely, you realize that they are obviously women. But people, I think, ignored it. So it was kind of an impressive time. It was interesting.
Battle of Lanes Mills coming up in Canisteo this Saturday and Sunday, June 1st and June 2nd. And we had Hornell history teacher Mark Smith in to tell us about it. Mark, thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope that everything goes very well this weekend.
Thanks for having me, Brian. I really enjoy coming up here and talking with you.